I should have known better than to buy the Hartwell house. Everyone in town had that look when I mentioned the address. Not quite pity, not quite warning, but something that made them change the subject quickly. The realtor, Mrs. Chen, had been almost aggressive in her enthusiasm, which should have been the first red flag. Houses don't stay on the market for 3 years in a town this size unless something's wrong. But the price was right, and I needed somewhere quiet to finish my dissertation. The isolation seemed perfect then. The house sat on Maple Street's dead end, a Victorian with good bones and windows that caught light in ways that seemed impossible given their northern exposure. Tall windows, the kind they don't make anymore, with glass so old it had that slight wave to it that made everything look like it was underwater. I moved in on a Tuesday in October. The movers commented on how bright the place was, even with the overcast sky. "Feels like summer in here," one of them said, wiping sweat from his forehead as he carried my desk past the living room's bay window. That night, I noticed the first thing. I was unpacking books in my study when I glanced through the window and saw Mrs. Henderson from across the street hanging laundry on her line. Nothing unusual about that, except Mrs. Henderson had been dead for 6 months. I'd read her obituary in the local paper when I was researching the neighborhood. I blinked and looked again. Empty yard, just the skeletal remains of her clothesline no longer strung. Fatigue, I told myself, moving stress. The mind plays tricks. But the next morning, making coffee in the kitchen, I saw her again through the window above the sink. Same floral dress, same methodical way of pinning sheets to the line. This time I watched longer, noting how the sunlight fell across her gray hair, how she favored her left leg like she had arthritis. When I stepped outside to get a better look, there was nothing. The Henderson house looked as empty as it had for months, windows dark, lawn overgrown. I started keeping a journal, not for any supernatural nonsense. I'm a historian, trained to document and analyze, but something was happening and I needed to understand it. October 15th saw Mrs. Henderson again. This time she was weeding her garden, which is now just dirt and dead plants. Watched for 10 minutes, she never looked up. October 18th, different person today. Man in his 50s, working on a car in the driveway 2 houses down. Car looked like a 1970s sedan, maybe a Buick, faded blue. Current residents drive a Honda SUV. October 22nd, children playing in the Morrison yard. 3 kids, maybe ages 6-10. The Morrisons are in their 70s and never had children. Kids were wearing clothes that looked old-fashioned somehow, like from the 1980s. I started researching the neighborhood's history at the local library. Maple Street had been developed in the 1920s, and families had lived in these houses for generations. The records were spotty, but I found enough to make my stomach turn. Mrs. Henderson had lived across the street for 43 years before her death. The man with the blue Buick was probably Thomas Crane, who died in 1994. The Morrison house had been owned by the Kellys in the 1980s. They'd had 3 children. I was seeing the dead. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I was only seeing them through the windows. I tested this theory obsessively. I'd see someone in a yard, walk outside, find nothing. I'd position myself at different windows and the scenes would change. The kitchen window showed the street from 15 years ago. The living room bay window seemed to prefer the 1980s. The study window was the most unpredictable. Sometimes I'd see the 1960s, sometimes the 1990s. Each window was a portal to a different time period, all of them past, all of them showing the street as it once was. I should have left then. Any reasonable person would have packed up and found somewhere else to finish their dissertation. But I'm a historian. This was the discovery of a lifetime. I started mapping the temporal patterns. The kitchen window consistently showed 2008-2009. The living room showed 1983-1987. The study cycled through different decades, but always between 1962 and 1999. I photographed everything, though the images never came out right. The camera would capture the current view, empty yards, modern cars, the Henderson house with its for sale sign, but I could see the past with perfect clarity. The people in these temporal windows lived their lives in loops. Mrs. Henderson hung the same laundry every Tuesday and Friday. Thomas Crane worked on his Buick every Saturday morning. The Kelly children played the same games in the same yard. They never seemed to see me watching. November was when I noticed the inconsistencies. I was observing the Kelly children through the living room window when I saw the youngest girl, maybe 6 years old, point directly at me. She said something to her siblings, and they all turned to look. For a moment, we made eye contact across 30 years of time. Then she smiled and waved. I stepped back from the window, heart hammering. When I looked again, they were gone. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that little girl's smile, how it had been too knowing, too aware. I found myself checking the windows compulsively, but they showed only darkness. At 3 a.m., I saw a light in the study window. Not outside, inside. The reflection of a lamp that wasn't there, casting light that fell across furniture I didn't own. Victorian furniture, heavy and dark, and sitting in a chair that occupied the same space as my desk was a woman in a white dress. She was looking directly at me. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. When I looked again, the window showed only my own reflection against the dark glass. I started researching the house itself. The Hartwell family had built it in 1923 and lived there until 1954. Then the Kowalskis, then the Brennans, the Washingtons, the Chens, no relation to my realtor, and finally the Merciers, who'd moved out 3 years ago. Each family had left within a decade. Most had left within 5 years. I found a newspaper clipping from 1987. Local family relocates after unusual experiences. The article was vague, but it mentioned the Brennan family's sudden departure from Maple Street after reports of temporal disturbances. The phrase made my blood run cold. I wasn't the first person to see through these windows. I was just the first person stupid enough to stay. December brought the voices. I'd be working in my study when I'd hear conversation from the living room. Not current conversation. The cadence was wrong, the references dated. I'd creep to the doorway and see nothing, but through the bay window, I could see the street as it was in 1985, and sometimes I'd catch glimpses of people inside the house. The Brennan family, they'd lived here in the 1980s, and somehow, echoes of their lives were still playing out in these rooms. I'd hear Mrs. Brennan calling her children to dinner, Mr. Brennan watching television, shows that had been off the air for decades, their teenage daughter practicing piano on an instrument that had been removed 30 years ago. The sounds were faint, like hearing a radio through static, but they were there. I started wearing headphones constantly. The worst incident happened on December 15th. I was in the kitchen making lunch when I heard footsteps upstairs, heavy, deliberate footsteps in the master bedroom. I knew I was alone in the house. I climbed the stairs slowly, my rational mind insisting this was just the house settling, just old wood creaking. But the footsteps continued, pacing back and forth across the bedroom floor. The master bedroom window faced the backyard. Through it, I could see the yard as it had been in 1973. There was a vegetable garden where now there was only grass, and a swing set that had been removed decades ago. And in the reflection of the window glass, I could see him. A man in his 40s, wearing a brown suit that was probably fashionable in the 1970s. He was pacing, agitated, running his hands through his hair. Sometimes he'd stop and look directly at the window, directly at me, and his expression was desperate. I realized he was trying to communicate with me. I pressed my hand against the glass and his eyes widened. He rushed to the window and pressed his hand against the other side. For a moment, I felt warmth against my palm, though the glass was cold. He was mouthing words. I couldn't hear them, but I could read his lips. Help me. Then he was gone, and I was alone with my reflection in the window. I spent that night researching the house's history more thoroughly. I found a death certificate for Robert Chen, again, no relation to my realtor, who had died in this house in 1973. Heart attack. He'd been found in the master bedroom. The man in the brown suit was Robert Chen, and he'd been dead for 50 years. But somehow he was still here, still pacing that bedroom, still desperate for help that would never come. I should have left then. I should have packed my things and never looked back. But I kept thinking about that moment when our hands had almost touched through the glass, the warmth I'd felt, the desperate hope in his eyes. I started talking to them. I'd sit by the windows and speak to the past. I'd tell Mrs. Henderson that her grandchildren were doing well. I'd looked them up, found their social media profiles. I'd tell the Kelly children that their parents loved them. I'd tell Robert Chen that his death had been quick, that he hadn't suffered. I don't know if they could hear me, but sometimes I thought I saw recognition in their eyes. The house was full of ghosts, but they weren't malevolent. They were just stuck, trapped in loops of their former lives, playing out the same scenes over and over, occasionally becoming aware that something was wrong. I began to understand why families never stayed long in this house. It wasn't that the place was evil. It was that the past was too present, too insistent. The weight of all those lives, all those decades, pressing against the windows like faces pressed against glass. Christmas Eve, I had my last conversation with Robert Chen. I was in the master bedroom, looking through the window at the backyard in 1973. He appeared as usual, pacing, agitated. But this time, when he saw me, he stopped and walked calmly to the window. He placed his hand against the glass, and I placed mine against the other side. The warmth was stronger this time, almost burning. He spoke, and somehow I could hear him clearly. "You have to leave this house." "Why?" I asked. "Because you're starting to become like us, trapped. I can see you more clearly now than I could at first. That's not good." I looked at my reflection in the window glass. For just a moment, I saw myself as I was now, but also as I might be in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. Still in this house, still watching through these windows, becoming another ghost for the next resident to discover. "The windows," Robert said, "they don't just show the past, they collect it. Everyone who's ever lived here leaves something behind, and if you stay too long, you'll leave something behind too." "How do I break the cycle?" "You don't, you just leave. Tonight." I packed in the dark, not trusting myself to look through the windows again. I could hear the house around me, decades of conversations, footsteps, daily life all happening simultaneously. The Hartwells in the 1920s, the Kowalskis in the 1950s, the Brennans in the 1980s, all of them layered on top of each other like double-exposed photographs. As I loaded my car, I glanced back at the house one last time. Every window was lit with warm, inviting light. I could see families inside, living their lives, unaware that their time had already passed. In the master bedroom window, Robert Chen stood watching me. He raised his hand in farewell, and I raised mine in return. I drove away and never looked back. The house is still on the market. Mrs. Chen, a different Mrs. Chen, I assume, calls me every few months to see if I'd reconsider. The price keeps dropping. I always tell her no. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about those windows. I dream about the warmth of Robert Chen's hand against mine, about Mrs. Henderson's methodical way of hanging laundry, about the Kelly children's laughter. I dream about the house collecting these moments, preserving them like specimens in amber, and I wonder if somewhere in those windows there's a reflection of me, a historian who almost became history himself, saved only by the warning of a man who died 50 years ago. The windows to the past are still there, still showing their eternal loops to anyone willing to look. But some doors and some windows are meant to stay closed. I should have left the house alone after Margaret died, should have sold it, moved somewhere smaller, somewhere without so many rooms that held her absence like cupped hands. But I couldn't bring myself to abandon the place where we'd been happy for 37 years. So I stayed, and I learned things about my home that I wish I never had. The cellar had always been Margaret's domain. She'd organized it with the methodical precision she brought to everything. Canned goods arranged by expiration date, Christmas decorations in labeled boxes, my father's old tools hanging on pegboard with their outlines traced in black marker. I rarely went down there. Margaret handled the practical matters of our life, and I was content to let her. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming and the sympathy cards accumulated dust on the mantelpiece, I finally descended those wooden steps. The cellar felt different without Margaret's regular presence. Staler. The air hung thick with the smell of old concrete and something else, something organic and slightly sweet that I couldn't place. I was looking for the Christmas boxes. November had arrived gray and bitter, and I thought putting up decorations might help the house feel less like a mausoleum. The boxes were exactly where Margaret had always kept them, stacked against the far wall near the old coal chute. But as I moved them, I noticed something odd about the wall itself. There was a section, perhaps 3 feet wide, where the concrete looked different, newer. The color was slightly off, grayer than the rest, and the surface was smoother, as if it had been poured more recently. I ran my fingers along the edges and felt the distinct line where new concrete met old. Margaret had never mentioned any repair work. In all our years together, she'd never hired contractors without discussing it with me first. We'd always made decisions about the house together. Always. I told myself it was probably something minor, a crack that had been patched, maybe a small leak that had been sealed. But the section was large, too large for a simple repair. And there was something about the way it was positioned, right at eye level, that made it seem deliberate. Over the next few days, I found myself returning to the cellar. I'd go down on some mundane errand, checking the water heater, looking for a screwdriver, and end up standing in front of that wall. The sweet smell seemed stronger near it, though I couldn't be sure if that was real or my imagination. I started measuring. The cellar was smaller than it should have been. I paced it off, then went outside and measured the foundation. There was a discrepancy of about 4 feet, 4 feet of space that should have existed but didn't. The hardware store clerk who sold me the hammer drill looked at me with the kind of patient concern usually reserved for the elderly and confused. "You sure you want to be doing this kind of work yourself, Mr. Hanson? I could recommend someone." But I couldn't explain to him what I was planning. Couldn't say that I needed to know what was behind that wall in my own cellar. He'd think I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. I waited until after midnight to begin. The drill bit into the concrete with a grinding shriek that seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the house. I worked in short bursts, afraid the neighbors might hear, though our houses were far enough apart that they probably wouldn't. The concrete was thicker than I'd expected. It took nearly an hour to drill through, and when the bit finally broke through to the other side, a rush of air came out of the hole. Not fresh air, something that had been trapped for a long time. The sweet smell poured out with it, so strong now that I had to step back. I drilled more holes, connecting them until I had a section large enough to break away with the hammer. The concrete came away in chunks, revealing a dark space beyond. I shined my flashlight through the opening. It was a room, small, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with rough concrete walls and a dirt floor, but it wasn't empty. There were things on shelves along the walls, jars filled with liquid, objects I couldn't immediately identify floating inside. At first, I thought they might be preserved foods. Margaret had always been interested in canning. But as I widened the opening and crawled through, the flashlight beam revealed details that made my hands shake. The jars contained parts of things, pieces that looked organic but wrong somehow, tissue that was too pale, too uniform, and suspended in the center of each jar, like specimens in a laboratory, were small, round objects that looked almost like. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered on the dirt floor and went out, leaving me in absolute darkness in that hidden room. In the silence, I could hear my own breathing, ragged and too fast. I fumbled for the flashlight, found it, clicked it back on. The beam illuminated something else. In the corner, partially obscured by shadow, was a wooden crate, old-fashioned, the kind used for shipping decades ago. The The lid was nailed shut, but there were gaps between the boards wide enough to see inside. I don't know what made me look. Some compulsion I couldn't name, some need to know that overrode every instinct telling me to leave. I knelt beside the crate and peered through the gaps. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all black and white. They showed the same subject from different angles, different positions. A child, a little girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair and serious eyes. But there was something wrong with the photographs. The child's expression never changed, not in a single image. Her eyes stared directly at the camera with the same blank, empty gaze in every shot. And in some of the pictures, I could see things in the background that shouldn't have been there. Medical equipment, restraints. At the bottom of the crate, underneath all the photographs, was a small leather journal. The pages were brittle with age, and the handwriting was spidery, difficult to read. But I could make out enough to understand that it was a record of some kind. Dates and times, measurements, observations written in clinical detail. The entries spanned 3 years. They described procedures, experiments, attempts to understand something the writer called the persistence of consciousness after separation. The language was technical, medical, but the meaning was clear enough to make me sick. I found Margaret's name in the final entry. Not as the author. The handwriting was different, masculine, probably belonging to whoever had lived in this house before us. But Margaret was mentioned as the new occupant, and there were notes about her suitability for continuation of the work. The journal described how the previous owner had prepared the house for Margaret's arrival, how he'd sealed the room but left instructions, hidden where she would eventually find them, how he'd selected her specifically because of her background. Margaret had been a nurse before we married, had worked in pediatrics. The final entry was dated 3 days before we'd bought the house. It expressed confidence that Margaret would understand the importance of the work, that she would continue what had been started. I sat in that hidden room for a long time, trying to process what I'd found, trying to reconcile the woman I'd loved for 37 years with the implications of what surrounded me. The jars, the photographs, the careful documentation of things that should never have been documented. When I finally crawled back out into the cellar, I noticed something I'd missed before. On the workbench, partially hidden behind a box of old paint cans, was a newer journal. The leather was less worn, the pages whiter. Margaret's handwriting filled the pages in her familiar, precise script. The entries began the month after we'd moved in. They described her discovery of the hidden room, her initial horror, and then, gradually, her growing fascination with what she found there. The previous owner had left detailed instructions, she wrote, a methodology that had been refined over decades. She wrote about the children who came to the house. Not often, maybe one every few years. Runaways mostly. Children who wouldn't be missed or whose disappearances could be explained away. She wrote about their contributions to understanding and the advancement of knowledge. The journal documented 23 years of work. 23 years of carefully recorded observations, measurements, and procedures, all conducted in the room I'd just discovered while I lived directly above, oblivious. The final entry was dated the day before Margaret's stroke. She wrote about her concerns for the future of the work, about the need to find someone to continue after she was gone. She mentioned me by name, wondered if I would be suitable, if I could be made to understand. I've been sitting here in the cellar for hours now, trying to decide what to do. The journals are spread out on the workbench in front of me, their pages open to entries I can't stop reading. The hole in the wall gapes like a mouth, and that sweet smell continues to drift out of it. I should call the police. I should report what I've found, let them excavate the room properly, let them identify the remains and notify the families. That's what a normal person would do, what a good person would do. But I keep thinking about Margaret, about the woman who made me breakfast every morning for 37 years, who tended her garden with such care, who held my hand during movies and laughed at my terrible jokes. How could that woman have been the same person who wrote these clinical descriptions of unthinkable acts? And I keep thinking about the final entry in her journal, about her concerns for the continuation of the work, about her hope that I might understand. The thing is, I'm starting to think I do understand, not the specifics. I'm not a medical person like Margaret was, but the underlying principle, the idea that knowledge, even terrible knowledge, has value. That understanding the deepest mysteries of human existence might justify costs. I found Margaret's current project in the room, a jar, newer than the others, containing something that still moves occasionally when the light hits it just right. The label is dated last month, just before her stroke, her final contribution to the work. I've been staring at it for an hour now, watching the gentle movement inside the glass. It's almost hypnotic, almost peaceful. There's a knock at the door upstairs, probably a neighbor checking on me. Mrs. Patterson from next door has been bringing me casseroles twice a week since Margaret died. She has a granddaughter who visits sometimes, a little girl with dark hair and serious eyes who reminds me of the photographs in the wooden crate. The knocking continues, more insistent now. I should go answer it, should invite Mrs. Patterson in for coffee, thank her for her kindness, assure her I'm managing fine on my own. But first, I need to finish reading Margaret's journal. I need to understand the methodology, the procedures, the careful documentation that made the work possible. The knocking has stopped. I hear footsteps on the porch, then the sound of a car starting. Mrs. Patterson has given up and gone home. But she'll be back. She always comes back. And when she does, I'll be ready to continue Margaret's work. Our work. The work that's been going on in this house for longer than I've been alive, and that will continue long after I'm gone. The cellar's secret isn't what I found behind that wall. The secret is that it was never really hidden at all. It was waiting for the right person to discover it, to understand it, to carry it forward. I think I'm starting to understand why Margaret loved me, why she chose me, why she never told me about the room but knew I would find it eventually. The sweet smell is getting stronger. I should probably open some windows, let in some fresh air, but I don't want to leave the cellar just yet. There's still so much to learn, so much to understand. And somewhere upstairs, the phone is ringing. It might be Mrs. Patterson calling to check on me, or it might be her granddaughter asking if she can come visit the nice old man who lives in the big house. I hope it's the granddaughter. I have so much to show her. I should have known something was wrong when the realtor wouldn't meet my eyes during the walkthrough. She kept glancing at the floor, her heels clicking against the hardwood with an almost frantic rhythm, as if she were afraid to let them rest in any one spot for too long. The house was perfect otherwise. Victorian bones, crown molding, those deep windowsills that catch afternoon light like cupped hands. The price was impossible, even for this market. Previous owners, I asked, running my fingers along the banister. Moved out of state, she said quickly. Job transfer. But I caught the way she stepped around a particular section of flooring in the living room, a subtle sidestep that looked practiced, instinctive. I signed the papers 3 days later. The blighting started on a Tuesday. I'd been living there for 2 weeks, long enough to learn the house's vocabulary, which stairs creaked, how the pipes sang in the morning, the way shadows fell across the kitchen table at sunset. I was making coffee when I noticed the first spot, just a dark stain between 2 boards near the refrigerator, roughly the size of a quarter. My first thought was that I'd spilled something. Wine maybe, though I couldn't remember drinking any. I knelt down and touched it, still damp. It came away on my fingertip, rust-colored and slightly warm. The smell was unmistakable, metallic, organic. The same smell that clings to the inside of your nose after a nosebleed. I cleaned it with bleach. The stain lifted easily, leaving the wood pale and raw-looking underneath. I convinced myself it was nothing. Old house, old stains working their way up through the grain. Houses remember things in strange ways. But the next morning, it was back. Same spot, same size. This time I watched it for an hour, coffee growing cold in my hands. The stain didn't grow or shrink. It just was like it belonged there, like it had always been there, and I'd simply failed to notice before. I called a contractor. He was a weathered man with careful hands who'd worked on houses like this for 30 years. He knelt where I'd knelt, touched where I'd touched. His face went very still. "You've got moisture coming up from somewhere," he said finally. "Probably a pipe leak under the foundation." But he wouldn't look at me when he said it, and when he left, I watched through the window as he sat in his truck for a long time before starting the engine. The stains multiplied. By the end of the week, there were 7 of them scattered across the living room floor, each one identical in size and color, each one appearing overnight like some horrible flowering. I mapped them obsessively, measuring distances, looking for patterns. They formed no recognizable shape, followed no logical progression. They simply existed, marking the wood like stigmata. I stopped walking barefoot. The thought of stepping on one of them made my skin crawl, though I couldn't articulate why. They were just stains, just moisture, just some explicable thing that houses do when they're old and settling. But houses don't blight. I started avoiding the living room entirely, taking the long way through the kitchen to reach the stairs. I moved my coffee maker to the bedroom. I ate standing up at the kitchen counter, always facing away from the doorway that led to those patient, spreading stains. On Sunday, I heard the dripping. It was 3 in the morning, and I woke to a sound like a leaky faucet. Slow, irregular, persistent. I lay in bed listening, trying to place it. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the way sound travels through old walls. I followed it downstairs, bare feet silent on the carpet runner. The living room was dark, but I could smell it before I saw it. That metallic sweetness, stronger now, concentrated. I flicked on the lights. The stains were larger. Each one had spread to roughly the size of a dinner plate, their edges soft and irregular like watercolor on wet paper. And they were moving. not flowing, not spreading, breathing, rising and falling with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. I backed away slowly, my hand still on the light switch. The dripping sound continued, but I couldn't see where it was coming from. The stains just sat there, pulsing gently like sleeping animals. I spent the rest of the night in my car. The next morning, I called the previous owners. It took 3 days of phone calls to track them down. They'd moved to Oregon, left no forwarding address with the neighbors. When I finally reached them, the woman's voice went tight the moment I mentioned the house. "We don't talk about that place," she said. "Oh, please, I just need to know." "We don't talk about it." The line went dead. I tried calling back 5 times. The number had been disconnected. I started researching the house's history at the local library, scrolling through property records and old newspapers on microfiche until my eyes burned. The house had been built in 1892 by a doctor named Samuel Hartwell. He'd lived there with his wife and 3 children until 1908, when the family disappeared. Not moved away, disappeared. The newspaper articles were brief and carefully worded, but I could read between the lines. The police had found evidence of violence. Blood in the living room, no bodies. The house had stood empty for decades after that, changing hands every few years. Each family stayed less time than the last. The pattern was always the same. They'd move in, live normally for a few weeks, then leave suddenly in the middle of the night. Sometimes they'd abandon their furniture, their clothes, their cars, as if they'd simply evaporated. I found 17 different owners in the property records. None of them had lived there longer than 6 months. I should have left then. I should have packed my things and driven away and never looked back. But the house had its hooks in me by then. When you live with something impossible, it becomes possible through sheer repetition. The mind adapts. The stains were just part of the landscape now, like the creaky stairs or the way the bathroom door wouldn't quite close. I learned to step around them. I learned to ignore the smell. I learned to sleep through the dripping. But I couldn't ignore what I found in the basement. I'd been putting off going down there, telling myself I'd get around to it eventually. The basement was unfinished, just stone walls and a dirt floor, a few shelves along one wall holding the detritus of previous owners. I only went down because the water heater was making strange noises, and I thought I should check on it. The dirt floor was soft underfoot, almost spongy. My flashlight beam caught something pale jutting up from the earth near the far wall. At first I thought it was a piece of pipe, maybe part of an old foundation, but as I got closer, I could see it was curved, hollow. Bone. I knelt down and brushed away the loose dirt with my hands. More bones emerged, ribs, vertebrae, pieces of skull. Not one skeleton, but several. All mixed together in the soft earth like ingredients in some terrible recipe. Some of them were small, child-sized. I sat back on my heels, breathing hard. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in. I understood now why the dirt floor was so soft, why it gave slightly under my weight. The entire basement was a grave. I climbed the stairs on shaking legs and called the police. They came with lights and cameras and men in white paper suits who worked with quiet efficiency. They cordoned off the basement, then the whole house. I watched from across the street as they carried out bag after bag of evidence. The detective who questioned me was kind but thorough. He asked about the stains upstairs, and I told him about the bleeding floors, about the smell, about the way they pulsed in the dark. He wrote it all down without comment. "The house has a history," he said finally. "We've been here before, different owners, same complaints." "How many times?" 17, always the same pattern. People move in, live normally for a few weeks, then start reporting unusual activity. Stains that appear overnight, sounds with no source. By the time we're called, they're usually ready to leave. "And you never investigated?" He looked at me with tired eyes. "We investigated the first time, found the bones then too, but the case went cold. No way to prosecute a 100-year-old murder, so we sealed the basement and hoped that would be the end of it." But it wasn't. No, the house remembers. Some places hold onto things longer than they should. The police finished their work and left. The basement was sealed again, this time with concrete. The house was declared a crime scene, then released back to me when the investigation stalled. I had 2 weeks to decide what to do with it. I went back once just to get my things. The stains were gone. The living room floor was clean and unmarked, the wood grain visible and ordinary. The smell was gone too, replaced by the neutral scent of old wood and dust. But I could feel them watching me, not the stains, something else. Something that lived in the spaces between the floorboards, in the hollow places where the dead had been disturbed. The house felt different now, expectant, like it was waiting for something. I packed quickly and left the keys on the kitchen counter. The house went back on the market a month later. The listing mentioned the historic character and original hardwood floors. The price was even lower than what I'd paid. I check the property records sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep. It sells every few months, always to a different buyer. Always young couples or families drawn by the impossible price and the Victorian charm. I wonder if they notice the way the realtor won't meet their eyes during the walkthrough. I wonder if they see how she steps carefully around certain spots on the living room floor, avoiding places where nothing visible marks the wood. I wonder how long it takes for the bleeding to start. The house is patient. It has been waiting for more than a century, and it can wait a century more. The dead don't hurry. They have all the time in the world. And the floorboards remember everything.